Hello, dear Catherine. Thank you very much for accepting this interview. Today, our aim is to talk about data feminism and possible ways to adapt data feminism to make research in urban studies with a particular focus on cultural heritage and history. Before opening up the discussion with my questions, I would like to introduce you to the audiences. So Catherine D'Ignazio is an assistant professor of urban studies and planning in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at MIT. She is also director of Data Feminism Lab, which uses data and computational methods to work towards gender and racial equity. D'Ignazio is a scholar, artist designer, and hacker mama who focuses on feminist technology, data literacy, and civic engagement. She has run reproductive justice hackathons, designed global news recommendations, created talking and tweeting water quality sculptures, and led walking data visualizations to envision the future of sea level rise. With Rahul Bhargava, she built the platform databasic.io, a suite of tools and activities to introduce newcomers to data science. Her 2020 book from MIT Press, Data Feminism, co-authored with Lauren Klein, charts a course for more ethical and empowering data science practices. Her research at the intersection of technology, design, and social justice has been published in the Journal of Peer Production, the Journal of Community Informatics, and the Proceedings of Human Factors in Computing Systems. Her art and design projects have won awards from the TANE Foundation, Turbulence.org, and the Knight Foundation, and exhibited at the Venice Biennale and the ICA Boston. So, Catherine, data feminism has been such a big influence for many researchers, including myself. I have read the book with a great joy, and it really opened up my mind because it shows the importance of having this critical perspective, not only towards data, but also towards societal power dynamics in general. And you show and advocate that intersectional feminism helps us understand how these dynamics operate in the world of data. And you frame data both as part of problems of our contemporary world, but also as solutions to those problems. So this approach also seems pivotal for the Data Feminism Lab, which, according to the website of the lab, uses data and computational methods to work towards gender and racial equity, particularly as they relate to space and place. So can you tell us how Data Feminism Lab was born and what convinced you and Laura F. Klein to write Data Feminism?
Sure, thanks. Yeah, maybe I'll start with the second because it came first. So the book came first and then the lab. But yeah, so back in, 2015, I wrote a blog post that was called, "What would feminist data visualization look like? How might we do data visualization in a feminist way?" And that particular blog post, it was pretty short, but it started to lay out some of these questions around power and data that we outline in the book. And it went viral in a very small way, which is to say in a small community of like visualization and data science people. But then through that, actually two people separately told me, "You have to talk to Lauren Klein." Because in fact, she had been also talking about feminism and data visualization, but more from a historical perspective. And so she does, she's a literary scholar and looks at early American sort of historical period. And she's been doing all this work on surfacing historical examples of data visualization by women and people of color that we don't typically put in the line of history of data visualization. Like usually when we historicize data visualization, it's all like white men who worked in national statistics offices. And so they said, like, you have to be in touch with her. And so we met, and that's when we agreed that we found each other's perspectives really complementary, and like our sort of expertise and disciplinary backgrounds were really complementary. And so we wrote a short paper together called Feminist Data Visualization. It was very short, like 4 pages or 5 pages or something. And then we had an opportunity through a connection that I had to actually write up a book proposal. And there was the MIT Press was very interested in it. And so we decided, like, okay, let's do this. Because one of the things that we realized when we were talking about feminist approaches to visualization is that you really can't, visualization happens kind of at the end of the data science process. Like, you do all this, you have to collect the data, you have to analyze the data, you have to explore the data and so on to arrive at the visualization. And so in a way, if everything that comes before it is flawed, then you can't have a feminist visualization without having feminist things that come before it. So we were like, okay, we have to expand this to encompass like the whole process of doing a data science project. So that's basically how the book came about. And then it's funny because during the process of writing Data Feminism, both Lauren and I changed institutions. So she went from Georgia Institute of Technology to Emory University, and I went from Emerson College, which is also in the Boston area, to MIT. And the exciting thing about coming to MIT is then I had the sort of opportunity to start up my own research lab here. And so it seemed very logical to me to build it off the work of Data Feminism. And so that's kind of where Data+Feminism Lab comes from. And really our mission is to try to do data feminism, So to say, like, okay, we've outlined these principles in the book, let's try to enact them in practice and through these applied projects in the lab where we're sort of building software applications and working with communities.
Thank you. In the book, you also provide a guideline of 7 steps. It's a guideline to implement data feminism. So based on those steps, do you think we can adapt data feminism to urban studies?
Definitely. Yeah, I think, we formulated those steps specifically in relationship to data and data science. But I think more and more these days, I am in an urban planning department, in fact, at MIT. And I'm part of a new program that we founded in urban science, where we're really looking at the intersection of urban planning, urban studies, and technology, data, et cetera. And I think as cities begin to mobilize technologies and data in all of these different ways at all these different levels, like everything from like procurement to management of infrastructure to management of cultural artifacts and cultural data and things like this. I think in this, basically as the landscape becomes more informationalized, the principles of data feminism are just more and more relevant, right? Because increasingly our places are not only physical, but they're informational. Like there's these layers of information on top of them or whatever. So, so I think it definitely has relevance for urban studies. And in my own work, in fact, like I thought it was really interesting what you were talking about with cultural heritage, because that's a place where we're going with the lab right now. Is we're working on a project called Audit the Streets, which is specifically about sort of auditing commemorative places in the landscape to look at who is commemorated, whose histories and events are commemorated, and conversely, who is not commemorated in urban places.
Thank you, Catherine. This was my next question, but you already answered. I was wondering if data feminism helps us gain new understandings of history now, not only understanding what's going on right now, but also a new way of looking back and analyze and understand, have a better insight into what happened. And I think Audit the Streets project does that to an innovative extent. So thank you also for talking about cultural heritage, because I think understanding the power of data is very important for understanding cultural heritage, because many heritage institutions are active in the production of cultural data, And especially in this COVID period, for instance, in Italy, many institutions forced themselves to launch digital projects. And actually in our department, we have now a project in which we are looking at this digital impact of the lockdown experience in Italy. And remembering that you are one of the co-editors of the book, Uncertain Archives, Critical Keywords for Big Data, how would you align data feminism with cultural heritage world, cultural institutions, and digital heritage, if we put it in a grander picture?
Sure. Yeah, I think there's significant connections there, especially what you were just talking about in terms of like when, as so many more of our cultural institutions, so our cultural institutions have always kept archives, like they're the keepers of history, right? And so one of the points that we make in Uncertain Archives is around how archives are always uncertain, right? They're never complete. There are always omissions. And that's been true since before big data and machine learning. Like there have always been sort of like missing stories, missing archives, things that the state did not feel were worthy of collection in these archives. But then it's even more, in a sense, you might say, accelerated and exacerbated in the era of big data, as we increasingly digitize, collect, and then can explore these archives in new ways, right? And I think one of the potentials there, and like kind of the reason we're doing the Audit the Streets project, is like where you take existing archives and you audit them, for lack of a better word. Like you use them as a way to explore what is not there, what has gone missing, or what you look at them as a kind of a map of power, which is not to say whatever's in the archive is not valuable, because I'm sure in most cases it's very valuable in itself too, but just that there are always omissions. And so like using an approach like data feminism is a way of saying, okay, well, like we know it's going to be incomplete. We know that certain groups or certain voices or certain identities are going to be marginalized. How do we explore this archive in a way that can fold them back into the equation, if that makes sense? And so like that's kind of the relationship that I see there. So it's almost like a reparative approach to archives or a recuperative approach to archives, where we think about how do we kind of expose the archive's shortcomings as a way of prompting the broader sort of public conversation about who and what should be memorialized, commemorated, archived. Like there are these larger conversations about power, which ultimately, hopefully in the ideal world, the archival institutions, the heritage institutions, see that public dialogue as a site of like rich, not only as like critique of the archive or something like that, but as a site of like rich public dialogue and engagement. Because I think that's really where there's like a whole lot of sort of public and democratic potential there. And just to give an example, like one of the classes I taught this spring was in collaboration with the city of Boston, who, and specifically with their public arts and culture department. And they've been doing this very systematic review of their monuments and public art archive, like really looking closely, because Boston's past is very colonial. Who we commemorate in the landscape, it tends to be like settler colonial, white guys on horses, who participated in the Revolutionary War. And so it's sort of like looking at like who's been sort of systematically erased from that history. And they're doing that work, like they're engaging with it in a really very authentic way and thinking about it in a very sophisticated way of like, like they're doing like internal equity trainings, they're redesigning their public art commissioning process, they're starting to do a lot more temporary artworks. So there's a lot of sort of multi-scalar ways that they're engaging with their own archive, which is ultimately an engagement with history. And then they're like inviting the public into that process. So like, I think that's ultimately like the, where we can go with a data feminism kind of approach. It's like, it's saying, let's take these sites of cultural heritage as a collection and analyze them as a collection.
I think also the writing process of data feminism is quite, at least for me, was unusual. How you put the draft and ask for comments and reviews. And also the 7th chapter of the book is show your work. And I think you already did it for Data Feminism, publishing it open access. But for most researchers, publishing open access can be very expensive. So how was your experience on that? And what are your thoughts about publishing open access? And how can we, as researchers, how can we show our work?
Sure. Yeah, thanks. I mean, one of the things we had, in a way, the luxury of the series that we published in with MIT. They always planned it to be open access. And so that was for us, that was one of the really attractive things of publishing a book with the series, was because it was by default open access. So it was not something that we had to have a big negotiation about or have a fight with the publisher or anything like this. Like, it was just kind of, that was what was on the table. And we really liked that. And I will say there's been all sorts of like additional benefits from that, which has been like, data feminism has ended up being included on a lot of course syllabi in different classes and all different disciplines. And I think one of the big reasons is because it is open access. And so like students can, if a teacher wants to assign just like one chapter, they can just send the students to the link. They don't have to like have them purchase the entire book just to read a portion of it or something. So it's been, I think, a great asset to the project, but I totally agree with you. There have been other situations for academic papers, for example, where I have felt really strongly that I want the work to be open access. And then I've had to go like raise the money from my institution to pay like $1,500 to make a single article open access. And I've done that in the past because I was able to like lobby my advisor to pay it basically for this one article at least. But I think that is also exorbitant, and we can't imagine that like the individual researcher could bear those costs either. Like, I think that's sort of untenable. So, I mean, I think like being creative and strategic where we can. I think also freely sharing our work when we can. So like one thing that I do is like, if ever anybody asks me, I do have articles that are not open access because I can't afford to make all of them open access. So like, but if anyone ever asks, like emails me for a copy, I always give it to them, and like, it's fine by me, basically. And I've never gotten in trouble with the publishers or anything. So I think there's like, gray areas where we can like kind of publish open access in a gray kind of way. And I fully support those kind of ways as well. But yeah, I sympathize because I think there's not, I think it's unfair to ask authors to shoulder the cost of the open access. Really, it's something that should be borne by institutions.
My last question will be a very personal one. And one of the recent projects that the lab contributed to is the Data Against Feminicide project.
Mm-hmm.
It is personal for me because I'm originally from Turkey, and unfortunately in Turkey, feminicide is a state-operated mechanism in which we can observe all 4 domains in the matrix of domination, as outlined by Patricia Hill Collins in her seminal work, Black Feminist Thought, that you also explain in the power chapter of your book. Yeah. So my question is that in an autocratic country like Turkey, where one can hardly reach the data and can never be sure about the accuracy of data, even when she reaches it, what alternative ways are there to collect data?
Sure. Yeah, thanks for that. And I just pulled it up here too, but I saw that Turkey withdrew from this Istanbul Convention, and then there were these big protests about Yeah. Yeah, I think this is really disappointing. And actually, through the Data Against Feminicide network, we're in connection with a couple of folks from Turkey who are. I don't know if they have their own data collection operation, but they're part of our network for sure. So I think they're involved in sort of monitoring gender-based violence. One of the ways that we talk about, because basically the work that we're trying to support through that project is a kind of citizen data science, basically. And this is actually ending up being the topic of my next book, because it's really interesting and it's happening in a lot of different countries, mainly in Latin America, but we've found folks in North America. We've interviewed a group in Kenya, and there's evidently a couple other ones in Africa. I believe there's a group in Turkey, there's a group in Germany, etc. But what they're doing is they are monitoring feminicide, which is gender-based killings of women, based on news media articles and social media postings in a given geography. And so they're doing this really interesting work where basically they have anywhere between like one person to like some groups are very large and have like 30 or 40 people monitoring news media. And as they come across reports about women murdered, then they copy and paste all the details about the case into these more systematized spreadsheets, and then use those numbers as a way to, in some cases, check the numbers of the government, or just put the numbers out there as the only data. Like you're saying, if the government isn't even monitoring at all, as governments often are not, then they put the numbers out there. And in some cases, like use the data to do sort of performative, symbolic actions in public spaces. So we're seeing a lot of that kind of performance in public spaces in like Mexico, in a Mexican context, for example, where people are writing in really large font, basically on city plazas, the names of all the victims for that year. So just filling this huge city plaza with names of the dead women, or doing graffiti on statues and things like this. So yeah, I think that this kind of like data activism is like this way that groups are monitoring back. And in the book, we talk about this as counter data, like a kind of feminist counter data, where you use data, kind of all the methods of data science, but it's a way that's kind of countering the hegemonic power of either the state, corporations, in some cases the media. It was a way to like speak back against the sort of consolidated power.
Thank you very much, Catherine. That was all of my questions, but are there anything that that I didn't think of asking, but you wanted to say?
No, I don't think so. I appreciate it. And I'm so glad to hear that your students appreciate the book. I was as we were writing, we really were trying to write for sort of a student audience, or like for newcomers who like, they might not know anything about feminism and they might not know anything about data. So we're trying to like, kind of be very accessible. So it's really gratifying to hear that that worked for your students. Yeah.
Both for my students, and I have to say also for myself, especially about intersectional feminism. It just provides so much an updated state of art, not academically, but also my way of thinking and looking at things has also been altered thanks to this book. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you. Thank you. That's wonderful to hear. Thanks.